Welcome to EV Hub Live, a live video podcast for professionals advancing transportation electrification. To find out more about the show, visit atlasevhub.com/live. On today's episode, we'll hear from Gabe Klein, Executive Director of the U.S. Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, about his impressions of the EV market, the CFI grant program announcement, progress implementing NEV, and the Joint Office's activities to advance transportation electrification. Here's your host, Atlas Public Policy's founder, Nick Nigro.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of EV Hub Live. I'm your host, Nick Nigro, and I'm very excited for this one-on-one conversation today with Gabe Klein, the Executive Director of the U.S. Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, a key player in advancing all of the goals of IRA and IIJA. We're going to talk about all kinds of stuff and get started right away with the EV market and EV sales. So welcome to the show, Gabe. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks for having me. It's great to see you again and great to be here.
Awesome. So let's talk about sales. EV sales, it's the big indicator that everyone always points to figure out whether or not the market's doing well, doing poorly, doing better than expected, meeting expectations, etc. There's been an increasing amount of attention lately on what is looked at or thought to be a decline in EV sales, but the data doesn't really show that, and that's sort of what we're showing here. The green bars are 2023 market share for EVs, and the orange bars are 2022. And what's obvious from anyone who's looking at this chart is, sales are, at least from a market share perspective, are continuing to grow, and they're considerably higher than they were a year ago. Can you sort of set the record straight on where you at the Joint Office is looking at EV sales?
Yeah, and we had data before just about anybody. We get it early from Argonne National Labs. We also get JD Power data, which Argonne gets as well and interpolates into their data. But essentially, we sold 800,000 PEVs in the U.S. In 2022, and in 2023. Over 1.4 million. So a pretty dramatic increase. And we also had a huge increase in charging ports. Went from 136,000 ports. Now we have 170,000. At the end of the year, we had about 167. We hit 170 on Friday, actually, when the White House put their fact sheet out, wow. Luckily.
Good time.
But that means in 1 year, there was a 25% increase in public charging ports. And on top of that, we had between 10 and 12,000, if I remember correctly, DC fast charging ports going, right? And we had like 27,000 at the beginning of the year and then almost 40,000 at the end. So, I mean, I don't really know how much better the numbers could have been in like 1 year. And, it's normal. Like we may see a little bit of leveling off in the first quarter. Although on the other hand, now you can get the point of sale credit, at the dealer, and there's like 8,000 dealers already offering it. On top of that, you can get used car credit if you're the first buyer of a used vehicle. And I don't know about you, but I'm seeing used like Tesla Model 3s all over the place with temp tags, like 2018, 1920s. A lot of gig drivers. Uber's doubling down and Lyft on EVs. Hertz said temporarily they're going to be doing less EVs. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to see a lot of fleet uptake too this year. It's the first time we've sold over 1 million EVs in the US in a single year. So I'm gung-ho on EV sales. And I mean, once you hit that, like we hit almost 10%, I think the market is spoken at that point. Like we're not going to go backwards.
Yeah, and I think that you pointed out a couple of things that I think are worth reiterating here. 10% approximately national sales is a lot. And you go into California and some other leading states, and you're exceeding 20%. for sure. There continues to be growth in a lot of areas of the market. On the other hand, the growth isn't going quite as evenly, I guess you could say, as some of the autos expected, which I think must be the source of where some of the tempered expectations we've been seeing lately in the media. But from our side, that's sort of par for the course. This is a once in a century sort of transition. And I remember a conversation I had with a reporter last summer when this new kind of narrative was starting to bubble up. And I was like, look at how long it took, how many months it took us to go from 0 sales to 1 million, and how many more from 1 million to 2 million, 2 million to 3 million. That's the sort of trajectory I think we have to be looking at to understand where the market is going. And, it's possible it could level out at some point, but yeah. Another big thing that people are talking about now, speaking of new cars coming out in the market, is this J3400 standard. This was formerly known as the NAC standard plug. That's the Tesla plug. And nearly all of the major automakers have lined up behind it and have said and predicted that, or committed to starting to introduce vehicles for sale with this new plug beginning next year, which is coming up fast, obviously. So tell us about that. Tell us about how you're, at the joint office, how are you guys looking at that? That's a huge, complicated beast to take on.
Yeah. Well, as you reminded me, pardon the sneeze in the background.
Good.
As you reminded me before, time is flying, and like 2025 seemed like it was so far away, but it's not. So with NACS, becoming J3400, this was a whole process that really started in the fall of 2022 when Tesla made the NACS standard open source, right? And at the time, we were formulating the minimum standards for the NEVI program, actually for all Title 23 chargers chargers that were funded through Title 23 funding. Mm-hmm. And so when we wrote the minimum standards, we said, okay, we're going to allow alternative connectors, including NACS, to be utilized on any Title 23 funded stations. That set in motion the ability for industry to coalesce around whatever they wanted to. And I don't think we forecasted the speed that industry would do that, but our job is to support industry and is to make sure that the customer is protected. The idea of having one standard is ideal versus two. And now it appears that, we were going to have two. We'll have two for the foreseeable future. But as you pointed out, pretty quickly, it looks like most automakers will be adopting a NACS like native port on their vehicle in 2025, at least within that calendar year. Now, one thing that's important to remember is that open source does not mean the same thing as open industry standard, right? So they open sourced it, but it took SAE and us working with SAE, Tesla working with them, and all the OEMs. And SAE did a spectacular job of putting it through this process in record time. They've never done anything this fast. And, I think it was December 9th that they put out a TIR, which is like a decision of record, basically saying, yes, this is going to be an industry standard. There's still work to do to actually get it to be a full, open industry standard, which will probably happen in the summer. And then the DOT is actually going to publish a request for information soon to inform how this technology is incorporated into the minimum standards going forward. So, I think some states and other cities, companies have a question about that. Right now, you can have both connector types on there. You can use fixed adapters as well, like Magic Dock, for instance. Mm-hmm. And then we sort of forecasted over time how we think that, eventually CCS may be retired. But our goal is to have a completely interoperable system, no matter if you have a CCS vehicle, a NACS vehicle, or a J3400 vehicle, that you will ultimately be able to charge at any location.
Yeah, and I think that's the goal for everyone, right? Is you don't want to go, you don't show up at a gas station and wonder whether or not you can use the pump. And I think that's the same expectations every day EV drivers are going to have when it comes to these, particularly federally funded stations. So I wonder, what's your advice right now for states who still haven't put out funding opportunities for NEVI right now for their first round? Do you think that they should just comply with the minimum level, or do you think they should go to include the connector, the J3400 connector, in anticipation of it being, a part of the program in the future?
Yeah, well, a couple answers to that. One is that, remember, they are minimum standards. Like, there are a lot of states putting in 350 kilowatt stations, even though they could be doing 150 kilowatt. The other thing is that we do allow for it in the minimum standards right now for the NACS connector, which will become basically J3400. And so we're seeing a lot of states that are basically future proofing, and they're saying, like, either they want both, excuse me, or over time they want the ability to migrate to a connector that is an open standard, which would allow them essentially to swap it out. And we've done some research into like what it would cost to swap it out. And I'm forgetting the figure off the top of my head, but it's a relatively nominal amount of money to take a CCS connector and the cord and replace it with a liquid cooled cord with a J3400 connector.
Well, that's good news, I think, for a lot of people out there when they wonder about, the sustainability, I guess, of these sites, because, most of the money going into this installations are getting the power to the parking spot. It'd be a shame if it costs so much money to swap out the equipment or add another plug or another connector. Speaking of distributing money and getting chargers in the ground, you all just Federal Highways just released grant awards for the charging and fueling infrastructure program, sort of the competitive grants program that was just issued. Lots of money going out to many states. You can see it here on the map that we're showing. A lot of money going into California, decent amount of money going into Texas as well. But the distribution is wide and it's across the entire country. What's your takeaway on CFI, how the awards went, the applicants looked, and what the reception's been so far?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great projects, right? There was like 3.7 billion in applications. So, and there was like 623 million to give out in this first tranche, which was actually 2 years of funding out of 5 because of the way the timing worked. There was corridor and there was community, and I would say there were it was a really nice split in terms of like medium heavy duty type projects and areas of focus, state level versus city and regional level applications. And I would say there was a good mix of electric versus hydrogen. We had 43 EV charging awards, 2 hydrogen, and 1 that was both EV and hydrogen. 22 states and Puerto Rico, and it's about 7,500 total charging ports. The other great thing about it is about 70% of the CFI funding was dedicated to sites in disadvantaged communities. And we've said since day one in the Biden administration that Justice 40 is a real thing that we actually want to do. And it's not that it's always important, actually, that the money end up in a disadvantaged community. It needs to serve it. But in this case, we're able to do both. But there's a lot more money to come for CFI. Also, last week, though, we announced we call it the EV RA. Both deputy secretaries and myself announced that the repair and replace program. That was supposed to be $100 million. But there was so much demand that ended up being 148 million. And, that's really exciting because those are chargers that are either like, just early, like the one I installed at 14th and U in 2009, and it's just like dead. It's sitting at a 45 a degree angle, and nobody owns it.
I've used that one. I know exactly the one you're talking about. Yeah, I remember that one. I used it a couple times.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
And speaking of that, we need more curbside charging. And our FOA, we also put out our FOA last week, or we put out the awards about, I think, $46.5 million. Some cool curbside projects with like It's Electric and I think 6 different communities, lower income. So really excited about the breadth between the 3 announcements over the last like 10 days and the different types of projects, different areas of focus.
Yeah. So tell us, for the audience who's not following, all these programs and award announcements so closely, where's this money coming from for the repair and replace?
Yeah, great question. So the way Congress wrote the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's $5 billion for NEVI. There's $2.5 billion for the CFI grants. But within NEVI, there's a 10% holdback. So after administrative costs and overhead, that ends up being about $460 million in NEVI. And to reach fully built out status on the AFDC corridors, which you have to do that as a state before you can flex the money to level 2 chargers or to give it to cities or whatever you would like to do with it. We only probably need between like 2.5 and 3 billion. So the fact that there's 10% set aside as stopgap is, I think, really, really smart. And this money, at the discretion of the DOT secretary, can be granted for anything that they feel like they sort of missed or needs to be done. And we at the Joint Office made a really strong pitch to Secretary Buttigieg and then Secretary Granholm that replacing chargers that were like, first generation, second generation, may not even be under contract anymore with an O&M contract. That's a really good use of funds, and it'll be fast. We can switch them out quick, and we can show people in their community that we're getting things done, and that broken charger that used to be there is now a working charger. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sends a really good message to all those site hosts too, that, I would have to guess that a good chunk of those dead stations or abandoned stations or problematic sites had some government funding attached to them initially. And in the early days of EVs, there wasn't a lot of requirements around maintenance and operations. And now there, of course, is. So I think this is sending a really good message. And it's also interesting for me to note the, money that went out for this repair and replace program is only a fraction of what you just said is still available. So we can expect a few more rounds of this, it sounds like. Is that right?
Yeah. So there's like another, let's see, $300 million in that 10%. And there's lots of conversations about what's needed and how to, fill gaps that may not be being met by NEVI or CFI grants.
Right. So speaking of NEVI, let's talk a little bit about that program. It's the elephant in the room, if you will, when it comes to single largest charging investment, I think, in our country's history, pretty much. And I do recall some press stories maybe a month or two ago saying, there hasn't been a lot of traction, a lot of progress on NEVI. And it was almost like, I don't know. It was bad timing on that press story because, as you can see from this map, there's just been considerable progress in the last month or so as the states have checked all the boxes that they had to do to set up their programs and started issuing RFPs, awards, in some cases construction. We actually saw just before we went live this afternoon that Pennsylvania finished construction on their first site. So one thing we all know DOTs are good at is doing construction projects. And so once they're empowered and they get going, it's clearly going to move pretty quickly. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit with us about, what are your first impressions of how NEVI's going so far? Are you surprised that it took this amount of time to get awards out the door? And what are your expectations for it in this year?
No, I wasn't surprised at all. And I had this question once before, and I was like, well, I ran a state DOT and a city DOT, right? And they're like, yeah. So this is how it works. Like you have to conceptually plan what you want to do. You have to go out and get feedback from communities, right? You have to hear from them. You have to do site design and plan where these are going to be placed. You have to work with the utility. You have to figure out through a procurement process how you want to do this. Do you want to do it as a program where you own the infrastructure and you do an O&M contract? Do you want to do a design, build, operate, maintain, a P3 of sorts? And states are taking different approaches. Colorado is subgranting almost all the money to local jurisdictions to build it out to the NEVI standards. So now, they're working at record time. And props, by the way, to all the states that have gotten their RFPs out and are just working overtime. I think they're doing a fantastic job. And for the ones that haven't yet, I would say, like, if you're nervous about the NACS connector or whatever it is, you can account for all of that in your RFP. Like, you don't need to wait. There's no need to wait. You should be going at 100 miles an hour because you can so easily make changes, during the design process, the build process, or you can account for it in the contract to switch out something like a connector. And I know we have some questions piling up, which we can answer on that. So I'm thrilled. And I think, look, we didn't get the minimum standards out till last, like a year ago, last week or something, right? Or maybe even, no, it may be in a couple of weeks. At any rate, no, they're doing a fantastic job. These are complex construction projects when you're building DC fast chargers. If you're putting a level 2 charger on a pole, it's a little bit different. And we're going to see a lot of those start going in fast with CFI grants. So I'm thrilled. You look at how long it took to build the gas station network. We're doing this in absolute record time. It's I think it's the second biggest public works projects that we've undertaken in the last 30 years. So I think maybe where we went wrong is we not went wrong, but you can always set expectations a little bit better as to how long it will take. And we said 500,000 by 2030, and we're going to knock that out of the park.
Yeah, that's the part that jumps out at me is people having misunderstandings around how this would go. Basically, those of us who work in or close to government know, there's a reason these processes are set up. You want to ensure equitable outcomes. You want to ensure, fair access, and all of that accountability takes time. And, so it came as no surprise to me that, we're only just starting to get going. But, now
also Nick.
Yeah.
Well, also, sorry to interrupt you, but the president clearly wanted American-made chargers. He wants to bring jobs back to this country. And if you're going to put that kind of money out there, there's not a better time to do it. And so, that might add a little bit of time too, but it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And I think that's something we've seen across the board in not just transportation, but other parts of the clean economy is, building that supply chain, that domestic / friendly country supply chain that we desperately need here.
Yeah.
Do you want to make a call or a prediction on how many states or how many chargers are deployed in 24 for NEVI?
Ooh, putting me on the spot. Well, here's the thing. It's hard to do that on just NEVI. We have so many programs now NEVI, CFI, EV raw. We have our own FOA, but I can tell you that, actually, do I have that number? We'll be, I think we'll be probably like 225,000 total ports is my memory. Of course, I'm saying this live on YouTube. Really smart, really, really smart. But
it's okay. We only have like 100 fact checkers or so ready to try to chime in.
But yeah, I think somewhere around 224,000 is my memory of where I think we'll end up at the end of 2024.
So I want to bring some of we are getting a lot of inquiries here from our friends watching online, and I want to bring Jesse's question to you just because I think it's so relevant to so many people who have an EV and have to experience public charging right now. So can you talk a little bit about the uptime reliability requirements? I got the question here up on the screen, and how these programs are going to hold site operators in public funding accountable for meeting those requirements.
Yes. So a couple things. We're creating a data platform called EV Chart. That's going to be launching next month. And that's going to ingest data from not just NEVI, but any Title 23 funded chargers. So there will be quite a bit of data to be analyzed, including uptime of chargers. So that's one thing. So we will know about the performance. And then two, the way the funding works with federal highways and DOT to the states, the funding goes to the states contract with vendors, excuse me, and they typically have performance standards in their NQAQC and sometimes liquidated damages and so on and so forth. It depends on the state. But they will be also, testing and making sure that the requirements are being met. And some of them have requirements, by the way, that are more stringent than the minimum standards. And then we are also, if you looked at our FOA, very interested in making sure that we are out there and we are testing. And so we'll be testing. In fact, I was talking to Sarah Heipel, our head of standards and reliability, and she said we'll also be doing thermal testing this year. So, we'll be testing how chargers perform in extreme heat and cold. We also in our FOA have resilience as a topic and working to figure out how to make the system as resilient as possible in different geographies. And some of that is heat and cold, and some of that is also sea level rise and things of that nature. So we'll be working on a lot of fronts. The actual enforcement, if that was part of the question, would be undertaken at the state level typically, but they'll have the information. So, and then of course the federal government, tends to hold the states to the standard that we set out at the federal level.
So you mentioned a few things that the joint office, or at least you all are doing in coordination with others, either in DOE, DOT, or maybe even the national labs. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about what the joint office is up to in 24, things that people can be looking forward to or anticipating happening coming out of your group. And, how are you going, you mentioned we're going to hit it out of the park for 500K chargers by 2030. Tell us other things that you all are going to be doing towards that goal.
Yeah. So, one big area of focus is hitting the president's goal and getting chargers in the ground. Another is making sure that the system that we build is reliable and sustainable for the long term. And so we've started something called the ChargeX Consortium. We actually have 79 organizations and companies involved now. And we're working on, we have 3 different working groups. We're working on, uptime, reliability. One of the big issues there is communications, modems and modems failing, things of that nature. We're working on uniform payment standards. We're also working on error codes, making sure that everybody's functioning with the same error codes, your EVgo or Electrify America or Tesla, so that it's simple and easy to figure out how to fix something. And if you have a third-party vendor, they know what error code 360 is because it's the same for everybody. It's simple stuff. Like a lot of it is like process oriented, but it's really important.
And super nerdy yet essential. Super nerdy but essential.
Super nerdy. So we're learning. The goal here is within 24 months to have a dramatically improved usability and reliability experience for the existing network. But we're adding so many new stations, which is good because they're newer, but also the companies involved are learning what they need to change and evolve and do for the new network. So it's really like doubly beneficial. Other things that we're working on, we'll be putting out a white paper in the next few weeks on, and I haven't talked about this anywhere, multi-unit housing, curbside charging, and multimodal hubs. So as we get more and more people buying vehicles that live in multi-unit housing, it could be condominiums, it could be apartments, it could be HUD housing. We've got to figure out how to provide people more access. And some of that's going to be in their apartment complex, some of it's going to be on the street. And so I'm very excited about that white paper. And this is sort of the year of the city and the year of curbside charging, I think, with all the CFI grants coming out. So anyway, those are just a couple things. I'll pause there.
The curbside piece is music to my ears as a city dweller, curb parker, street parker. What we have to do in DC is run a cord across the sidewalk and put a mat over that so that nobody will trip, but we can only charge at level 1. And so it's pretty inconvenient. And, I love the district government, but like, it would be great if they could get off the dime and try to develop a real program that allows reasonable charging in neighborhoods, because I think that, it's an important part of the charging experiences to be able to charge at your house. And, I love the idea of the joint office providing some much needed support there.
Well,
especially for the DC residents.
Yes. And I'm also a DC resident. I feel the same way. I would love to see them do that. I'm also really interested in bring your own cord, which you see in other countries, right?
Yeah.
Because what's worked well in the US in particular, I think, is pole-based charging. And they've been very successful in New York. They had 99% uptime, no vandalism to speak of. They placed a lot of the chargers sort of on the border of commercial and residential districts. It was really, really well done. And I think it's going to expand. They've also had that experience in Los Angeles. But if it's not up on a pole and it's on the ground, there is tendency for more vandalism, intersecting with sidewalks and scooters and bikes and different things. And so, the funding that we made for Alexandria, Virginia, Detroit, Jersey City, and Los Angeles to have chargers at the curb, but no cord, is going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
No, and I think it's fabulous. Right? Yeah.
And you can see a world where like there's a 240 outlet at every parking space, right?
Yeah. Well, Gabe, please build that for all of us. Thank you very much. We are a little over time, so I want to respect your time and let you get back to it. I'm sure you've got another meeting coming up in a minute or two. So thanks so much, Gabe, for joining us on EV Hub Live. I really appreciate the conversation.
Great. And one last thing, I know we had some questions that we didn't get to, so I'm happy to answer them offline if people want.
Yes, we will pass those along. If folks want to put their contact information, reach out to us at Atlas. We can pass those messages along to Gabe and his colleagues over at the joint office.
Yep.
Really nice of you to do that, Gabe.
One last thing. The person that did ask about switching out the cable, Yes, you basically can. The protocols for CCS and for J3400 are really no different or not significantly different. I don't want to say anything stupid here because, you know, I should have somebody more technical on, but the reality is that you basically can swap out the cable.
Yeah. That's my understanding of the underlying protocols as well, is that they're following the same, same process. Well, if it all works the same is another question, but it should be pretty straightforward. I agree with you.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Gabe. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Nick.
Appreciate you joining us. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this episode of EV Hub Live. I want to thank Gabe again for joining, and we'll be back again soon. Thanks so much.